Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Richard Lenan. I teach here at the School of Theology and Ministry. I'm pinch hitting for Tom Groom this afternoon. Tom wasn't able to be here and sends his apologies. So it's my pleasure to welcome you all here. Thank you for coming, and particularly to welcome our guest, Father Eamonn Conway. Last time I introduced Eamonn was 10 years ago in Sydney, so we do this every 10 years on a different continent. So I'm expecting to do it somewhere in 2027.
South Africa,
maybe. That'd be nice. That'd be nice. Eamonn is a priest of the Diocese of Tuam in Ireland. He did his theology at Maynooth, and which he later taught as well, and then he did his doctorate in theology at the University of Tübingen in Germany on Rana and Balthasar, which was Rana being the good one and Balthasar being the other one. Since then, Eamonn has spent a good part of the last few years very heavily involved in theological education, religious education, but also in various theological societies, both in Ireland and in Europe and in the wider theological world. So he comes to us very highly skilled and highly steeped in the sort of work that we do within the School of Theology and Ministry. At present, he's the head of religious education at Mary Immaculate Institute at University of Limerick. So we're delighted to have him with us. He spoke this morning at a seminar that BC runs on priesthood, so he's now opening his presentation up to a wider audience. I'd also like to welcome Father Eamonn Fitzgibbon, who's a compatriot and a colleague of Eamonn's at University of Limerick. The principal reason we invited Eamonn to come to be part of the discussion is this book that he edited a few years ago called Priesthood Today, Ministry in a Changing Church. And it's a whole range of perspectives on priesthood, on the relationship between priests and bishops, the relationship between lay ecclesial ministers and priests. So a very broad and also deep survey of lots of issues that affect priesthood in the contemporary church. And that's going to form a good part of the presentation that Eamonn's going to do with us this afternoon. So let's please welcome Father Eamonn Conway.
Thanks very much. Thank you very much indeed, Richard, and thank you very much for coming out on this eve, the eve of St. Patrick's Day, which of course, first time I think I've ever celebrated St. Patrick's Day outside of Ireland. So I'm looking forward. I've already had one invitation for tomorrow evening to some, I'm told it'll be a fairly wild party. Looking forward to that very much. But delighted to be here with you and to have an opportunity to share with you on priesthood. As it happens, this year is the 30th anniversary of my own priestly ordination. And I used to think, thank you, when I heard of guys who are 30 years ordained, I thought they were ancient, you know. And now I realize I'm one of them, you know. So it's a great honor to be with you this evening. Now, I've given you just a handout, if you like, with the kind of just the bullet points, just to give you a structure for my presentation this evening. And I'll move through it reasonably quickly because I think we're a fairly experienced group at engaging and so on, and I really would like to allow time for a good conversation. Richard has said to me about 40 minutes or so to speak to you, and hopefully it'll allow for that. I'm also not assuming for one moment that you've read the book or that even after the seminar you're going to order the book. You know, I'm well used to American theologians coming over to Ireland and saying, and by the way, I brought a box of books with me, you know. I didn't bring any. In fact, I didn't even bring my own copy. I was, you know, budget airlines, you know what they're like. But anyway, the profile of the book is there, and Richard very kindly has his copy with him. So the seminar to which I was asked to contribute this morning is the C21 project, which has as its goal to provide the Church with a contemporary theology of priesthood within an emerging understanding of ecclesial ministry that can guide its recruitment and formation of candidates, and likewise offer a theological resource for addressing the pressing pastoral issues within priesthood at this time. So you've set yourselves a very important and very significant task at this time. And I suppose at some level, the reason I'm here with you is because we've been doing a little bit of reflecting along those lines in the book project, which you have very kindly introduced. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about that in the beginning, and then I'm going to move away from the book project and give you some ideas. I think the title which was given for tonight was Opening New Horizons. So where do I think maybe are the places we should be going in terms of constructing theology for priesthood and ministry for now and into the short-term future at least. Okay, so we're going to begin by talking a little bit about what was in the book. And again, I hadn't actually looked back at the book since it was published in 2013. I hadn't actually looked back at it and stood back from the editorial work of analysing essays and getting everything right to see what was in it. When I did, I was very pleased overall with what I saw. I think I would say, first of all, it reflects what I think is very true of the Irish approach generally to addressing issues, a kind of a percolating up theology rather than a trickling down theology. And it's a phrase from Bausch that was used, in fact, by my colleague Eamonn Fitzgibbon in his particular essay, that in a sense the essays reflected theology on the ground and how this was informing practice. Just a few themes from the first part of the book. The first part of it looked at the implications of having to live, work and administer priestless parishes and parishes clustered together. Now I understand this is becoming a phrase and a concept over here. We've been looking at the issue of clustering for some time. I think you went initially here, from what I gather, at amalgamation of parishes. For various reasons that wasn't tried in the Irish context. The challenges of collaborative ministry, particularly in terms of mutual and respectful relationships between lay people, lay ecclesial ministers and clergy working together. That was one of the themes in the book. And then, if you like, they were sort of internal issues. Then the external context. I think it would be fair to say that at the moment, those of us working and ministering in the Irish Church consider ourselves to be playing against the wind, to use a sporting analogy. It's quite a struggle in some cases to represent church in the public square. And so how do we deal with that? So for example, the impact of the perceived irrelevance of clergy and of increasing disregard for the voice of the church in the public square. That was one of the topics addressed. But on the other hand, I suppose the sense of joy and renewed energy that comes from the fact of having new lay collaborators in that task. Also, we looked at the role of the new communication technologies and how do they help us to be a different kind of presence in the public square. So there were some of the themes that we looked at, particularly in the first part of the book. And then the next part of the book sent us back to the sources, back to the tradition of the church, back to various spiritualities. For example, a very fine essay by Father Michael Paul Gallagher, the Jesuit, on the voice of Ignatius, another one by another Irish Franciscan, Caoimhín O'Leja, on the voice of Francis, and so on. So that was, if you like, just to give you a flavour of the book. From there we moved into looking at the personal demands that ministry today makes on the life of the priest. We looked at the issues of living celibacy, if it can be lived in a fruitful and joyful way. What resources do ministers need personally? We also deliberately built into the book, how do lay people see clergy? How do clergy see working with lay people? We also looked at the changing nature of the relationship between the bishop and the priest, and vice versa, the priest and the bishop. How has that been changed, particularly in our context, I suppose, by the abuse crisis and certain demands that places on that particular, or strains that puts on that particular role. So I move to the next point. What ecclesiological understandings inform the contributions? And you can just see a number of points on the bottom of your handout. I think, again, as one would expect, or at least hope, generally at the level of, if you like, thought leaders, of those who are reflecting theologically, we would say that the idea of baptism as foundational for all ministry, that understanding of conciliar teaching and post-conciliar teaching has been received. While the common priesthood of the faithful is exercised by the unfolding of baptismal grace, a life of faith, hope and charity, a life according to the Spirit. This is from Pastoris Dabo Vobis, but it was quoted twice in the book. The ministerial priesthood is at the service of the common priesthood. So this understanding of baptism institutes the priesthood of the faithful, and the ordained priesthood is at the service of the priesthood of the faithful. Important to note here is the basis for recognizing that lay people do not receive their ministerial callings from the clergy, but from Christ through the Holy Spirit. And equality and unity flow from the realization that the clergy are not a second people of God apart from the people of God. And this is a vital point in establishing the right relationship between clergy and laity. And it's something I'm going to return to later on. So this understanding, very clear understanding, that lay people are empowered for ministry through baptism, in a sense that baptism is their ordination in a certain sense. Ordained ministers then have a role of serving those called by the Holy Spirit to other ministries. And that includes, and a very important part, that includes proper formation and the provision of proper formation. Second point, the church's communion and awakening an understanding of co-responsibility. And I think we saw in a number of the essays a sense that co-responsibility is a much stronger phrase than maybe collaboration. Collaboration can still, you're collaborating with me in what I'm doing, but co-responsibility brings out the fact that this is a shared enterprise. So the church as a community of disciples and a communion of communities was the most dominant ecclesial self-understanding found in the book. And this was very much underpinned by the understanding of Vatican II's understanding of the church as the people of God. The following points we saw emphasized: the priest as a visible agent of communion, that communion should characterize all ecclesial relationships, and that the basis for such relationships is the mystery of Trinitarian communion. And again, that if we are operating this, if we understand this properly, it overcomes any dynamics of dominance between lay and clergy, that the communion is stronger than any sense of individualism or dominance. A third emphasis, if you like, in the operative ecclesiology we saw in the essays was the universal call to holiness. The Vatican Council's emphasis on the universal call to holiness is considered to have brought the Church to a new understanding of the relationship between lay people, religious, priests and bishops. And again, the importance of equality in these relationships. And a fourth one, perhaps one when I only saw it really when I went back over the essays, there still was maybe a minority voice, but I think one that was represented nonetheless in the essays, understanding the priest by ordination as nonetheless a man set apart with a particular unique service to the people of God. And we saw this particularly in an essay, a very fine essay by the philosopher William Desmond. I don't know if he's familiar to you here. He teaches in Villanova every year. He's just retired this semester actually as head of the School of Philosophy in Catholic University of Leuven. But he sees the priest very much as the mediator of beauty in the face of evil and terror. He talks about the consecrated nature of priesthood in a very powerful way. He says the consecrated nature of priesthood is vital in a world suffering from the loss of the sacred. And he asks, can the priest witness to beauty in horror and the horror of the cross? And I suppose there was a little tension between that understanding and other voices that feared, as one sister who contributed to the book and has a lot of experience in pastoral ministry and collaborative ministry, the fear of the absolutizing of ordination and that the kind of the power dynamic that can build up. So that little tension going on there. Fifth point is the charismatic principle of the church as co-constitutive. There's recognition in some of the contributions of the role of the Holy Spirit generously bestowing gifts upon the church and leading it to ever deeper unity. However, I think a more developed pneumatology is more conspicuous by its absence. And this very much was a topic we discussed this morning in our seminar, as how do we hold together the pneumatological, the Christological, the ecclesiological on our understandings of priesthood and ministry. One of the very important contributions was by a Jesuit called Jim Corkery, who now teaches at the Gregorian University in Rome. A beautiful phrase Jim has been using for some time, which I love, is that in terms of our attitude to the world, we should go out there as detectives of grace. It's a phrase worthy of Pope Francis, really, isn't it? And I think in the past, maybe many of us were formed in a world where we sensed we should be detectives of sin. more than detectives of grace. But it's a lovely phrase that positively disposes us to recognize where the Spirit is at work, where the Spirit is flowing in the life of so many people who may not necessarily recognize it the way we can and can recognize it in that way. And along similar lines, one of the contributors is Dermot McCarthy, who was a very senior civil servant, in fact the most senior civil servant in the Irish government for a number of years, and has since been ordained a deacon. And he says we should approach the world with an invitatory mood, seeking allies in the service of justice, truth and love. Particular challenge in a way when we feel maybe a little alienated in the public square, to hold on to that kind of a positive disposition, that sense of, again, being a detective of grace rather than of hurt or of sin or of evil or whatever else. And I think those of us who work in the Irish context struggle with keeping that kind of a positive disposition. So I would say in conclusion, the ecclesiological foundations that inform the contributions as identified here show that conciliar and post-conciliar teaching on priesthood and ministry have in principle been received, at least at the level of those who are reflecting on this theologically. Almost all the contributors were people who regularly give in-service programs for those in ministry, for dioceses and so on. And so in a sense are on a kind of a circuit, if you like, of giving input. So these are the kind of things that are being heard in the ether. I do have a question about how at a deeper level they've actually been received and are operative in the structures, and we'll come to that in a few moments. So in what follows, I want to move beyond priesthood today. Let me just stop for a moment. Do you have any questions on anything I've said there so far? Feel free to interrupt me. I'm very interruptible. Yeah?
What did you, in E, the church as co-constituent?
Yeah. The charismatic principle of the church as co-constitutive. I mean by that the understanding that the Spirit is breathing life into the church, is constituting the church. That the church is to see a much more dynamic rather than a static understanding of the foundation of the church. That's really what I'm getting at. I'll be coming back on that point because I think it's one we really need to build upon. But understanding the pneumatological principle or the charismatic principle.
In the book, is there an article that looks at priesthood and availability of the Eucharist to so many people and celibacy?
So just give me a second. Not specifically, because as yet in Ireland we haven't reached the stage where that Eucharistic famine that is common in other communities has been experienced. And so the issue of, is celibacy, mandatory celibacy, a block to ordination or having sufficient number of candidates for priesthood is not specifically addressed because it's not as yet felt. Where now one of the issues actually in the intervening times that has currently been looked at is the role of lay people in Eucharistic services. We're just moving now and debating that. In fact, I think it was one of the major themes at our last Bishops' Conference, whether we actually want to have lay people holding Eucharistic services in the absence of a priest on Sundays. But that we're only moving into that conversation at the moment. But the issue of whether mandatory celibacy is a concern about blocking candidates for priesthood and therefore leading to Eucharistic famine wasn't specifically addressed. Just because you've asked that question, we're familiar with, I think in the last week or 10 days, even since I prepared this paper, Pope Francis made a statement in an interview with Die Zeit, with the German newspaper, in which he appeared to open up the possibility at least of looking at the question of viri probati. Are you familiar with this? Just again, one of these comments Francis makes and it kind of takes legs. I just thought an interesting comment by a French bishop. If you look at La Croix, which is a French religious newspaper journal, the Bishop of Toul, Bishop Bestion, he says that celibacy is not optional celibacy is not the solution because mandatory celibacy is not the problem. And I think he makes an interesting point that he says, for example, we've had married deacons for quite some time in this diocese, and my door is not being beaten down by people who want to be ordained to the diaconate. And he actually, for me, it was certainly a pause for thought that a lot of the lay people who are taking on lay ecclesial ministries are being brought into a maintenance model of priesthood, of ministry, rather than a mission model. And that there's still, he says, one of our problems is we seem to think that we must put all our energies and efforts into maintaining a system of a structure that served us well in other centuries but no longer serves us now, that we haven't made this shift to actually being truly missionary. And he says, my problem is not a shortage of priests. My problem is a shortage of younger priests and of young people in communities coming to Eucharist and celebrating Mass and being active. And he says, who's going to reach out to them? So I just thought it was an interesting observation. It was in response, in a sense, to what Pope Francis said, but you'll find it in La Croix. Okay, any other comment before I move on? Okay, so I'll just continue on then. So we're moving just beyond priesthood today now, and just in the intervening couple of years, a couple of things that have come up. One is a very interesting book that was published in 2015 by John Weafer. John Weafer is a well-known researcher in Ireland, worked for many years for the Irish Bishops' Conference, but he only wrote his doctorate recently, and it was on a qualitative piece of research called 33 Good Men. So the tone of priesthood today, because it was meant to be a resource, particularly for renewal, for encouragement and so on, for priesthood and ministry, was deliberately positive, forward-looking and encouraging, and yet I hope it was realistic. I suppose 33 Good Men is more hard-hitting, it's more factual in terms of what this qualitative research threw up. Weafer interviewed 3 categories of Irish priests and former priests: those in seminary ordained prior to Vatican II, those ordained in the 70s and 80s, and those ordained in more recent decades. And one of my colleagues, Eugene Duffy, summarised his research as follows, quote, "There are distinct generations of priests in the Church in Ireland with diverse values, beliefs and understandings of priesthood. The oldest group began with a rather cultic approach, which over the years merged with the servant model of the Vatican II group, while the youngest group are categorised as neo-orthodox, focusing more on the sacramental dimension of priesthood and traditional church practices that give them a greater sense of certainty in an uncertain world." One of Weafer's conclusions is that while the priesthood as an institution is not in crisis, interesting observation, there is a palpable tension and polarisation within priesthood due to different models coexisting, namely the servant leader model versus the cultic, the latter being the preferred self-understanding of the younger neo-orthodox clergy. So we see this emerging in the Irish context. I would see it doing in service with various dioceses. It's more pronounced in some dioceses than in others, but I think it is an emerging pattern. On the issue of celibacy, a particular focus of Weafer's research, he was a former seminarian himself, there is general agreement among older clergy that they were never properly formed or resourced to live a fruitful celibate life. This often contributed to a sense of emotional isolation and loneliness, and in their view, celibacy should not be mandatory. Younger clergy, on the other hand, tended to see celibacy as an important part of their identity, as something that set them apart from others. Again, interestingly, Weafer's research showed that while not publicly disagreeing with objective norms in regard to the Church's teaching on sexuality, in the privacy of the confessional and the counselling room, the approach tended to be the approach taken by some of the older clergy tends to be more pragmatic and relatively liberal. He said a lovely phrase. Weaver suggests that these older clergy could be considered company men with attitude. They avoid direct conflict with their superiors. They get on with doing the job as they see fit for the most part. On the other hand, he says younger clergy come across as unquestionably loyal to church teaching and also to their leaders. Interesting point. We might come back on that one. Some bishops would say to me they find a number of younger clergy at times very difficult actually to deal with. But anyway, we shouldn't generalise. Weafer concludes his study by remarking that he was left with the impression that, quote, a deep personal commitment to priesthood that has energised and sustained most of them in times of personal difficulties and societal changes to the priesthood. And to this extent, in fact, his research seems to reach the very same conclusion as a much wider survey that was done in Europe in 2000 by Paul Zulener at the University of Vienna, he published it as Priester in der heutiger Kultur, Priests in Contemporary Culture. And the title he gave his publication was a line from a psalm, they continue on and do not grow weary. A sense of that sort of resilience that's there, and a sense of maybe a quiet joy, certainly a sense of getting on with the job among priests. So much about, if you like, priesthood. Where are lay ecclesial ministers at in the Irish context? What's their experience? Well, we don't have anything comparable to 33 good men, and I think it's a real lack. I was suggesting this morning we could have a very interesting piece of transatlantic research where we had a group of researchers here and in Ireland doing some qualitative review of how lay people are experiencing being ecclesial ministers, maybe putting some of the same questions and issues to them that were put to 33 good men. However, in our work in Limerick, in our own consultations as we're setting up a new institute for pastoral studies, we've had a number of meetings with lay ministers, and I just want to list some of the things that have come up. It's not, I suppose, as verifiable or objective as maybe some of the other research, but I think nonetheless it's reasonably sound. First of all, I think a lot of lay ecclesial ministries find the lack of recognition and acceptance by their fellow lay people of what they're about as a hindrance to their ministry. So their role has not been properly understood by their fellow lay people. One of the problems here, and I think it's a foundational one, so if you remember I said earlier on, I stressed with you about baptism being the foundation sacrament for lay ecclesial ministry, and that it doesn't come from the priest. In other words, this idea of lay people as Santa's little helpers, it has no theological foundation. But I do think, unfortunately, in a lot of cases with ministry other than the ministry of the priest, we've got off to the wrong foot. If you talk about a lay minister, the way we do word associations, many people will think of a lay person distributing communion. And we call that person technically what kind of Eucharistic minister? Extraordinary Eucharistic minister. An extraordinary. Thereby saying they really are only doing this when we don't have enough priests to do it. And I think, unfortunately, that's the operative understanding of lay ministry that has been received for many, many people. That really the lay person, if we had enough priests, we wouldn't need all these lay people doing these things. And we've got into a similar kind of a situation in Ireland with the permanent diaconate, which we've just introduced. The first permanent deacons were ordained in 2012. Now, the very fact that we've waited until there's a decline of priests to introduce the permanent diaconate is telling you something. And I've been saying this until I'm blue in the face in the Irish context. There's only one reason for ordaining deacons, and that's a shortage of deacons. Not a shortage of priests. A shortage of those who represent the ministry of charity in a particular close relationship with the bishop, in the sacramental recognition and representation of that. But in fact, de facto, we're introducing permanent deacons because we have a shortage of priests. So there's a problem here, I think, that we need to consider. So there are two issues just in terms of lay people, and it relates to the ministry of deacon as well. Lay people, I think, are experiencing clergy as gatekeepers, as lacking energy, as being somewhat apathetic and blocking reform. And also, and I think this is quite serious, given, I think, a specific responsibility of the ordained to provide proper formation for lay people, as being anti-formation and maybe even anti-intellectual. The point I've already made, the failure to shift from a maintenance-oriented church to a mission-oriented church, with some clergy settling for being functionaries within a maintenance model rather than taking the risk of mission, or simply, and this has to be said in fairness, simply not being able or finding the freedom to make that shift because of mounting and increasing maintenance tasks. The only thing I would say within that is that, and again I say this from the luxury of not being in a parish where I'm perpetually burdened by these kinds of maintenance responsibilities, but I do think maybe we can approach a lot of maintenance tasks in a missionary key. So for example, I do think of when we celebrate sacraments with people who very often are not, although they're coming by way of exception, maybe a wedding or a funeral or whatever. to actually see those as missionary moments, and I think that can be done. And some lay people have voiced concern that we're missing we're failing to cash in on the Francis effect, and in a sense the opportunity, the wind beneath the sails that the ministry of Pope Francis is providing to us, that we're failing to seize the moment. Okay, so a few points by way of hopes for the future of priesthood and ministry. Where did I leave my water? Oh, there we are. Thank you. We'll take another 10 minutes, is that right? So the first point I want to make is just a point about hope. James Allison, an English theologian, he says, whatever Christian hope is, it begins in terror and utter disorientation in the face of the collapse of all that is familiar and well known. And I think in our fallen human condition, sometimes we only allow the Spirit in, and we only really allow hope to grip us when we're down in the pit, when we're in terror and in disorientation. And I think just as a general point, perhaps it's a way of looking at what we might see around us as decline. And I think a lot of priests in Ireland at the moment are experiencing some of that terror. They're worrying about themselves, understandably about their future, about mounting parishes coming their way, being asked to minister and so on. But I think we do need to put a frame around and say that this may well be the context in which something beautiful and something new is going to emerge. In Western countries, we're experiencing a collapse in ordained ministry, with numbers declining and the age profile rising. But I think nonetheless, even though we cannot fully understand this moment in history we're currently living through, we can hope that it carries in it the seeds of something as yet unimaginable. But a few points I think that might help, if I can call them, I know in business circles they talk about lubricants for change, things that make change easier, that oil the system towards change. Just a few points. To return to that issue of the pneumatological, of the Spirit. I think we need a greater understanding and acceptance of the pneumatological, and I think this is key really to the renewal of priesthood. A quotation I came across many years ago, but one that I think still has a lot to say to us, George Tavard. He says, the action of the Spirit and the believer's forward-looking anticipation of divine gifts to be received in the future have taken second place, being subordinated to the Church's memory of Christ and to its preservation of the deposit of faith. And he uses this phrase, a domination of ministerium by magisterium, a kind of a static understanding of ministry. And I think that has been problematic for us. So I think recovering a sense of trust in the presence of the Spirit. If you were to ask me where do I see this happening or have any example of it, I think the synod process that Pope Francis has led us through for the last couple of years is a perfect example of it. I think we could miss the wood for the trees. Clearly the issue of the synod, the content of the synod around marriage and the family has been hugely important. But I think even more than that has been the recovery of the synodal process at the heart of the life of the Church. And if you think about it, he led us through that very carefully from a wider consultation. Now, whether people took it up or not, or how they took it up, how they embraced that, they had to take responsibility for that, into the extraordinary synod. In a sense, it was kind of a little graduate seminar for the presidents of bishops' conferences, the first synod round, to the time of adjustment, of openness between the two synods, of conversation and so on, and of mounting concern on the part of some, to the World Synod of Bishops itself, and then the post-synodal exhortation. And Francis, making it clear at one point, I think in the Relatio at the end of the extraordinary synod, saying, Peter has been with you in this. So that was, if you like, the ecclesiological dimension asserting itself, but having allowed the space for the Spirit. I think it's been hugely interesting, and letting go of extreme views on both sides, and finding some kind of a consensus. And I think, in a sense, that may well be the legacy of Francis, if this has now found grip and has got traction at the heart of the Church. So I think that has been working very, very well. A second point I think we do need to consider very carefully as we go forward with ministry is how we understand power and authority to be exercised. And I think there are two reasons for this. I do actually think the sexual abuse crisis which you have suffered through here in Boston, and obviously we have suffered through in Ireland, sexual abuse is an abuse of power. And if you speak with victims, as I have, and maybe many of you have, you will know that they found the failure of the institution to respond as painful, if not more painful, than the actual acts of abuse they may have experienced themselves. Because this powerful, as they saw it, institution was insensitive and non-responsive to their particular needs. That whole issue alone, I think, requires us to look at how we understand power and authority to be exercised in the church. If you wish to come back on that, I will. I won't delay on it now. But I think the other point is that there is evidence to show that the operative understanding of priesthood that some of the abusers worked out of affected or gave them permission, if you like, to engage in abusive behaviour, and how they understood power and so on, how they experienced in themselves inner powerlessness. As for example, Marie Keenan, researcher in the Irish context, has shown that a lot of those who perpetuated abuse experienced an inner powerlessness within the structures themselves and so on. So this issue of power, I think, needs to be looked at, and I think we can't ignore the fact that particular understandings of priesthood affect how we understand and experience and exercise power. So that's another point we may wish to return to. In a sense, preparing for this paper, I found myself wanting to reread some of the work of Peter Huneman, with whom I worked in Tübingen. During the 70s and 80s, Peter wrote a number of articles on priesthood understood as representatio Christi, representatio ecclesiae, and showed how both of those bring up different understandings of power. I think a third point we need to look at, and this one of course ties in with where Pope Francis is leading us, is decentralization. He called in Evangelii Gaudium for a sound decentralization. And one of the questions I have for myself, we have a very fine document since 1972, Ministeria Quaedam, which opened up the possibilities for local bishops' conferences to petition for the establishment of stable ministries. The only non-ordained stable ministries we have in the church to this day are acolyte is one, lector is the other. Both restricted to males, interestingly. Both restricted to males. Extraordinary. Now, there's absolutely no basis for this. At the World Synod of Bishops in 2012, on the new evangelization, at which I was present, I was tasked with, we were each given different themes to follow, and the one I was given to follow was on the role of catechists. And there was a strong enough movement, actually, to want catechists to be established as a stable ministry in the church. But the answer we got was, it's already covered by Ministeria Quaedam. There's no problem with local bishops' conferences petitioning us to recognise that. But why hasn't it happened? Why have we not embraced that diversity? The role of women in decision-making in the church. Again, I know many people may not be happy with it, but Pope Francis has pushed a little bit further, at least, than predecessors in Evangelii Gaudium in calling for us to explore the role of women in decision-making in the church. And the International Network of Societies for Catholic Theology, Richard mentioned, with which I've had an involvement, has established a three-year research project on this very topic, looking at how can we consider decision-making roles for women in the church. I think that's another priority that has to be addressed. I think the issue of baptism needs to be embedded as foundational for ministry. I think we've accepted it in theory, but operatively that has to be embedded in the life of the church. And finally, just a few other points from Pope Francis. There's never been a pope, I think, who has spoken out against clericalism as often as Pope Francis. I tracked a bit of that for a paper I did last year in Manila, and he just speaks about it again and again and again. Related to that is his concern about the clericalization of the laity and the danger, in a sense, of that. And I wonder if, in fact, that's operative a bit in how lay people get so involved, perhaps, in the issue of the reform of structures in the church, and are taken away from the more missionary approach to the church. I just wonder if that might be at work. Again, Pope Francis has spoken repeatedly about the need for the proper formation of ministers. And he says, in fact, this is essential if the missionary option, which he has spoken about, or everything being transformed into a missionary key, is to actually be realized in the life of the church. Related to this, of course, is his big emphasis on the need for ministers to be comfortable with, and we've all these different phrases, proximity, closeness, with the church understood as more like MASH. Does that name remember mobile, the show, the TV show? So the church to be more like MASH than the Mayo Clinic. One could put it that way. But this being at home with the vulnerability that so many people experience in their lives and responding to it. Again, obviously, to go back to that phrase of Jim Corkery. So we need ministers who are open to being detectives of grace, who are prepared to actually engage in ministry with empathy. And I think without empathy, we've got very little going for us. And the final point maybe I'll make here is about embracing diversity of approaches and understandings. Both Pope Francis and his opponents, actually, I think they've done us a favour. They may not have intended to, but those who are opposed to the ministry of Pope Francis have actually done us a favour in helping us realise that we can have unity with diversity, and that we can agree on very fundamental matters and still be a church that is one holy, Catholic and apostolic. I think that's a space that has been opened up in the last year or two, particularly now over chapter 8 of Amoris Laetitia. That's a genie that can't be put back in the bottle. That we now have a space where we can openly disagree. We can even issue dubia on key issues. I go back to Karl Rahner in 1975 at the Synod of the German Church, the Synod of Würzburg, which was the synod whereby the German Church, if you like, appropriated Vatican II. And in that synod, in his addresses to help prepare that synod, Rahner said, the decline of a homogeneous Christian society will inevitably lead to a plurality of Christian forms. And he saw this as positive. It reminds us, in fact, that all structural forms in the church are in any case provisional from an eschatological perspective. If you remember the chapter in Lumen Gentium of the Pilgrim Church, it talks about the structures bearing the mark of an age that will pass away. However, Rahner says polarization needs to be avoided. And he says polarization is not caused by the existence of diverse views in themselves, but that those who hold these diverse views think ill of one another and refuse to pray and to work together. And I think that's an important point, that we tend to allow our diverse views to drive us apart rather than actually hold them in tension together. So in conclusion, I think in many of our countries, at least for some time, the church will of necessity take the form of smaller, but hopefully confident, missionary-oriented communities, sacramental in their outlook rather than sectarian, inward-looking, more at home on the street corners, roads and country lanes than huddled in the upper room. And so we need ministers, lay ecclesial ministers and ordained ministers, who are open to that understanding of ministry. It's my best hope that the Spirit will send them our way and that we will have the grace to receive them. Thank you very much.